Well, good morning, Matt. I appreciate you inviting me on today to share some thoughts on managing fertility and organic rotations. As always, it's difficult to put a presentation to meet everyone's expectations, from the beginning organic farmers to guys that are 30-year veterans. But I hope everyone today can take something of value away from my presentation. If you have one thing that you learned today, I'm going to feel like it's a success. So with that, I'll get rolling. A little bit of background on myself. I grew up in a small farm in Illinois, and I've worked on a variety of farming operations from organic to conventional. And I went to school in South Dakota State University and got a BS in agronomy after I started reading a lot of different soils books. Been blessed to have consulted with organic guys now for over 9 years. And 6 years ago, started farming on the side myself on a small farm here in Minnesota. So one thing when it comes to managing fertility, I think it pays to step back and look at all the different things as a farmer, as a business owner, you're trying to manage on your operation. And just putting a small list here together, you can see it's quite extensive and oftentimes is very overwhelming. So one of the things when it comes to coming up with a good fertility plan in your farm is to make sure you're spending the time to plan and you're not just reacting to your current year, current environment, current market. So, the first question I ask with a producer when I sit down with them is, what is your plan? And is it reactionary or is it strategic? And in the conventional world, and especially guys that are new to transitioning, reactionary tends to be a little bit more the norm, partly because we have very quick acting, if you want to call them, tools in the toolbox when you're referring to pesticides. Organic management is much more strategic. It's much more long-term. We generally don't have quick solutions to problems, so you need to address it from a long-term systems approach. So the other thing that planning does is when you have a plan for your season, it minimizes those emotional decisions that can cost your operations a lot of money, or you make in the spur of the moment and looking back 6 months later, you go, well, I was just stressed out and I wish I could redone that one. So planning ahead really helps eliminate as many of those emotional decisions as possible. There are always things that happen in the season that you're going to have to react to. The better plan you have, generally the easier you're going to be able to handle those situations. One thing when I talk about organic fertility, I'm not here to give anyone a cookbook recipe. I think especially for newer organic producers coming from a conventional world, they're used to more of your standard cookbook recipe from the co-op, right? So many pounds of N, so many pounds of K, so many pounds of P for this crop, so many pounds for that crop. Organic farming is much different, I think, in that respect. We have to look at the system as a whole to really do a good job when it comes to managing all the aspects of our farm, but most importantly, fertility as well. So really appreciated this sign on the lawn of one of the farms that I worked with, and I think it exemplifies the point. There's more than one way to skin a cat. So when we're putting together a fertility plan over the rotation, it really comes down to, I think, 4 steps. And the first step is to assess your farm, assess your system, assess the crop, what you're trying to do, trying to accomplish. Then once you have your data points, make a plan, come up with a plan. And number 3 is the most critical part, because we can come up with the best plan in the world, but if we can't execute it, it's not going to do us any good. And the 4th part is a key step of this process that I think is missed in a lot of regards. A lot of guys don't monitor over the season to provide that feedback and those data points to essentially go back to step 1 for the next year and do a reassessment of their plan. So step 1 is to assess, and there's so much more here than fertility. I think guys have to keep in mind, it's not just pigeonholing a certain amount of pounds of this fertilizer, or a certain amount of pounds of that fertilizer, or a certain number of tons before corn of manure. There's a lot of different things when you're putting together a fertility plan that all play into that final answer. You know, for example, selecting your yield goals. What's a realistic yield goal on your farm? Well, what's all tied to yield goals? Well, what's your yield history? What's the genetics of the beans or the corn or the small grain that you've been growing in the past? What's the availability for on-farm nutrients? What's the availability for off-farm nutrients? All these things play into that final plan for fertility. And I think they're important categories that a person needs to analyze when looking at it from a systems approach. The other big one for organic farms is weed challenges. You know, the big two, fertility and weed management. It doesn't do any good to come up with a good fertility plan or a proper fertility plan for an excellent crop if we don't have a way to manage those weeds that are going to rob all the nutrients. Putting more fertilizer on in a situation like that is just going to grow bigger weeds. So again, not specific today to talk about weed management, but again, to emphasize it's an important part. The other thing I think that's important for farmers to remember is we can only manage so many of these variables when it comes to a crop or a cropping season. And while it certainly is stressful when we don't get rain, or stressful when we're getting too much rain, the other part of that equation is really focus on what you can do to manage the crop, what things are in your control, and try not to worry about those things that are not in your control. So what are we assessing? We're talking about organic fertility, but what is it? I think a saying, a phrase that's very common in the industry or agriculture as a whole is one cannot manage what one cannot measure. But the other key part of that is it's critical to know what one is measuring in order to measure with the correct instrument. You know, if I'm going to take the length of a board, an odometer and a tape measure are both very good tools for measurement, but I'm not going to use an odometer to come up with a correct measurement for length of a board. So I think it's important to know what we're measuring and then to use the correct tools to measure that. Otherwise, we can get lost in the weeds. So just to pull it back to that first question, what is fertility? And crop fertility essentially is the capacity of an ecosystem to provide crops with essential plant nutrients. Another point tied to that would be soil health or soil quality. And I want to split apart the definition of those because with the current carbon revolution that we're seeing, I think there's a blurring of the lines between the two where people are confusing soil health with soil fertility, crop fertility, and vice versa. So what soil health is the self-regulation, stability, and functionality of a soil as or in an ecosystem. And what's important there is when we're looking at crop fertility, we're looking at it from the standpoint, what I'm growing on there and am I providing the nutrients for that crop. When you're looking at soil health, you're looking at it, is my soil healthy and is what I'm growing there a benefit to that soil stability? And as a grower, I need a system developed to grow something that's going to yield that I can sell at the end of the year. From a soil health perspective, I can grow CRP. I can do a grazing system. It doesn't necessarily have the same end goal as having good fertility. So why is that? Well, one of the slides I like to use is segregating when we talk about soil fertility versus soil health or soil structure. What are the areas of the soil that we are more focused on? And when we refer to soil fertility, we're referring to the mineral portion of a soil and the organic matter portion of the soil and the nutrients that are derived from those components. When you talk about soil health, what we're really looking at is that soil's ability to either hold or percolate water, or that soil's ability to have a decent amount of air in there to provide oxygen to the microbes. And again, that's tied in the structure, which organic matter is very important in holding that structure. And so while they're related through the organic matter, soil health and soil fertility, they're not exactly the same thing. We are talking about two different things. And a good way to think about it in thinking in terms of soil fertility and soil health, because they do have an effect on each other, and that would be soil fertility is very similar to like a bin. And depending on your type of soil, your organic matter levels, the types of clays that are there, each soil is going to hold a varying amount of nutrients in that system. And what soil health is more of the auger that's used to transfer that grain from the bin, so to speak, to the truck. You want to think of the truck as being the nutrients that end up in the plant. And so what soil health is and does is move the nutrients from the soil to the plant. And if you think of that in terms of an auger size, right? If I have a 4-inch auger, if I have very poor soil health, I'm not going to get good nutrient flow to the plant. If I have a 10-inch auger, I'm going to be able to accomplish that nutrient flow much, much better. So again, they're related, but they each address different functionality of the soil. Soil fertility, tied or moving or making more available what's there to the plant at a quicker rate does enable us to have and maintain crop production at lower soil test levels. And that's really due to the biological activity. But it takes time and it takes patience to build that soil health level up. It doesn't happen. You don't go from a 4-inch auger to a 10-inch auger all in a day. And so individuals that all of a sudden go, I'm not going to be worried about fertility anymore. I'm just going to solve my problem through soil health. Well, if you don't have much of a bin, or if your bin's very low in grain, so to speak, soil health and even increasing soil health is not going to help you maintain or even or maximize or maintain even your crop production. So another way to look at it is what are the nutrients that make up fertility? And when we look at the nutrients that make up fertility, we look at CO2, carbon dioxide, which provides the bulk of the carbon that's found to build into the plant material. Water and the splitting of the water molecule in the photosynthesis process provides the hydrogen and oxygen that make up those as, or make those as primary nutrients of the plant. And the rest of our nutrients are all found in the soil, and they're broken down into primary, secondary, and trace minerals. The primary nutrients are basically the amount or the nutrients that the plant uses in the largest amounts, and secondary and trace minerals then subsequently get used in lesser amounts. All of them are important, but obviously the primary ones that make up the bulk of the plants are going to be most important. So then, now we know what we're measuring, which is fertility. How do we measure it? And going back 100 years, qualitative measurement was pretty much the only good option that was out there. And through visual symptoms and signs, you certainly can pick up certain nutrient deficiencies in the field. The problem is, while you can pick them up in the field, generally by the time you see that nutrient deficiency on your plant, it's too late to do a corrective measure. Qualitative can also be used to measure things such as good manure and bad manure. If you look back in the historical literature, you know, varying degrees of those types of terms were used, but the exact value of that manure was never discussed because we didn't have the testing abilities to actually see what was in there. Today we've had the development of our standard tool for managing fertility, which is soil tests. And soil tests are or they're a measurement of the nutrient levels in the soil, but they're not tied to exactly the total pounds in the soil. What they're actually calibrated to is more or less yield goals of, at this specific level, whether it be low, medium, or high, generally speaking, you have a probability to achieve X amount of yield. And while depending on the soil type and the soil testing level, you can calibrate it back, and there are certain formulas to go actually back to pounds per acre. It varies widely across a number of soils. So it's a little more difficult in terms of pounds. And again, it's not necessarily critical. What's critical is to basically see or manage those nutrient levels to meet and maintain your goals. So soil tests can really do three things in your system. It can, first and foremost, determine where you're at, your current nutrient levels, to see what your potential of the fertility, or if you want to think of it as your on-farm resources on your own farm, where you're at. What can I produce with what I have? The other thing that soil tests, particularly as you take them over time, do is they help you determine what the trends are for those nutrient levels in your soil. And that second part is just as important, I think, as the first. You know, and I'll get into that in just a minute here, why that is. But knowing whether your system is building your fertility levels up or it's depleting your soil fertility levels is critical, I think, in the long term to stay viable and keep your fertility at a sufficient level. And then using those pieces of information, you can determine the needs of the crop and the needs that you over the entire rotation, as far as, am I maintaining these nutrient levels? The other thing, soil testing, and I've seen these often used as sales tools, whether it be tissue test or soil test. And a farmer, it's good to have some background as far as what's high, medium, and low, because in our day and age, I'll see a lot of colors on the field, red, green, and the coloration on the test doesn't necessarily indicate that it's low. It's just in relationship to the other values that are there is less than. So you may have a red value. I've seen, for example, soil test grid samples come back as red. Well, the red just indicates that it's less than the rest of the field. It doesn't necessarily indicate that you're low in that nutrient. And so if you're not careful, what you can end up doing is you can buy a nutrient that you really don't need on your farm. Traditionally speaking, going back through the years, composite samples, one sample pulled per field, has been more the traditional method. With technology and the revolution in the industrialization of agriculture, we're seeing more site-specific analysis done with grid and zone sampling. Whether or not they pay, it depends on the variability you have over your field. It never hurts to check and do a grid sample once, but it's not something, if you have a pretty or very uniform field, that you'll need to do all the time. Or if you have a lot of variability or zones of fertility, generally the most cost-effective way to manage that variation is to sample your field by zone. Doing it by zone a lot of times can save you money in the sense that you start putting nutrients where they're needed, and you don't over-apply nutrients where you're not going to see a return on investment. Probably the number one product that would be correlated to ROI with variable, with grid sampling or zone sampling would be liming. A lot of times you see when you pull grid samples that only half the field would need the lime. So it's pretty easy when you're starting to use 2 or 3 tons of a material to put significant savings to pay for and give you an ROI to do management on a grid level or zone level. There's a little bit of confusion today in the industry in regards to different soil health tests and quote unquote new nutrient analysis or nutrient profiles in the industry. The Haney test in relationship to the traditional soil test is now being sold as a new test that's more reliable. And I've ran a lot of side-by-sides in different soil types, different systems. And what I found is that for the most part, the Haney test, when we look at the extracts of our nutrients such as potassium, it actually follows and mimics very closely to our traditional soil tests. So in regards to that, at least from my internal testing, what I've done, I really don't see a value in spending the money on the Haney test. I don't think it really provides any additional information in that regard. As far as the soil health calibration, Sovita test level, or what would be called the largest component that goes into soil health calculation, which is the Sovita CO2 burst. That does have some correlation to soil health. And while that can show us the size of the auger, again, it's not particularly useful in determining the total amount that's there. And what I see working with organic producers, particularly guys that are transitioned 4 or 5 years, is with our systems, typically, what I see out in the field with a shovel can smell, taste, touch, dig in the soil with the tilth correlates very, very heavily with what that Sovita reading does. So as a producer, I don't know if you need to run a Sovita test. Other than I do foresee the value if you're working with a landlord that wants you to prove from a quantitative standpoint that you're improving your ground over time. But really, as a farmer, you can get a very good idea what your Sovita reading will be by just going out to your field with a shovel and doing some digging. The other thing that's very important as a farmer and looking at your system is to understand where your nutrients come from. Notice when I use the word fertility, I'm not saying fertilizer, and that's not to claim that fertilizer is never needed, but fertilizer is not or equivalent to soil fertility. What we're really looking at when we talk about soil fertility is we're talking about what the mineralization of that soil can provide to your crop. And so in your more standard soil test, you'll see there's very low, medium, high, and very high nutrient levels. And what that's really relating to, if you look at this chart, is how many nutrients going to that crop are going to come from the soil, or what's the soil's ability to provide that nutrient to the plant. So why fertility is not the same as fertilizer as far as terms is because when we talk about soil fertility, a good share of the soil fertility you have on your farm comes from the natural weathering process of the minerals in your soil. And so some farms are blessed with a high mineral content of different nutrients where they can farm alfalfa, let's say, for 20, 30 years. And despite the fact that they're removing a lot of potassium from their farm, the mineralization of their soils and the weathering of those natural minerals found there provides and replaces the potassium that they pulled off from the previous year. So not every soil is going to need fertilizer. But if you're not blessed with naturally high mineral levels of potassium, and you look at the chart up top, what you'll see, especially with alfalfa in the rotation, which is a very heavy potassium feeder, is you can draw down very, very rapidly the potassium level in your soil. Other places that fertility comes from that's not strictly tied to fertilizer would be things such as manure. The other part is also hay. And when we're looking at a fertility plan on your farm, it's important to take all those inputs that are coming from off the farm or on the farm into account when coming up with a cropping plan. Same thing for output. It's important and helpful to track what nutrients are being removed by soil by both tracking the grain or the forage that's being pulled off of the soil, or the feed if you're taking it off via hay. And so what you're measuring is output versus input, and can my soil naturally provide or make that difference up over time, if there is a difference. So once you've gotten your soil test and you know where you're at, or better yet, you have soil tests from several years and you see where you're at and where you've been and where you're going from these trends, the second part of that is to take a plan or come up with a plan. And a plan in an organic system can still apply the 4 R's of good nutrient management: right source, right time, right rate, and right place. Just because we're organic farmers doesn't mean we're disconnected from these 4 R's that are related to good nutrient management. So to start with the right rate, what's the right rate in my fertility plan? And to go back to that earlier chart, what we want to see, or what we're analyzing, is the level in the soil, where I'm at, and what can that provide for yield? And if I add fertilizer, what realistic yield goal could I potentially hit? And that difference in between is essentially what we're going to need to look at to supplement via some fertility source, whether it be fertilizer itself, could be from manure, it could be from feed, essentially in the form of manure that's ran back through the soil or bale grazed on that soil. But if I have a soil test level and I'm trying to shoot for a higher yield, I will need to make up that difference if my soil test levels are not high. The other key part of right rate in a rotation that's absolutely critical to look at is what's the ROI and how does that cost relate to the other costs that I have to carry on my farm. I think it's important to note that if all of us had an unlimited budget, it would be very, very easy to come up with a fertility plan. Unfortunately, in the real world, most of us are balancing a lot of other costs, and that has to be done in the context of other costs because there's a limited budget that we can deal with on the farm. So what we're really doing is we're trying to balance both risk versus reward, and we're also balancing what's the ROI of putting, let's say, this fertilizer on versus a different fertilizer, or fertilizing my corn versus fertilizing my beans. How much difference in yield is that going to make? What's the current price of those crops? And what I like to do coming up with this as well is to look at, okay, there's variables we can control, such as fertilizer amount, but then we still have to take in mind, well, what if it's a very dry year and water is my limiting nutrient, quote unquote, limiting resource, like we saw here this last year. And it's good to run your numbers when you're doing your projections both ways. What does my cash flow look under a normal year? What does my cash flow look under a stressful year or a year where there's an act of God type of scenario? And the budget that I'm spending, can I cover that under a worst case scenario? And that will tell you what you're risking. So guys that fertilize for the moon, you might be going for a one-hit wonder. And if you have that act of God year of no water, too much water, you may, despite your best effort, end up losing more money than you can carry from a cash flow perspective. So the economics of fertility is very, very important to tie back to your plan because it's an integral part of your system. The other aspect is, and the reason why on a limited budget, it's important to look at what's going to give you the largest ROI is because of the law of diminishing return. And what you'll see, and farmers have experienced over the years, is that more fertilizer does not relate necessarily to more yield. And if you look at the graph on the right, what you'll see is that there's an exponential function related to response of a plant to a nutrient, and subsequently there's an inverse relationship to the ROI. And as you get to the top side of that graph, higher and higher, from that 95 to 100% potential of that piece of ground, that return diminishes. And that varies from year to year depending on price of the crop, price of the fertilizer, for example, or fertility source. But it's never generally at 100% of the yield of that crop, partly due to there could be other variables that consistently bring the yield of that crop down, such as too much water or lack of water. Could be the type of ground just does not have that potential. So in looking at the law of diminishing return, what you're looking at is finding that sweet spot where I can maximize my dollars to maximize my ROI for my fertility plan. The other important factor, though, when coming up with that is when you're looking at a nutrient and you're budgeting in your system, perhaps you get a lower yield goal than what you would have desired. But keep in mind that if you have a lower amount of fertility going into your system, it does run a higher risk as far as weeds being grown in there, where the lower the amount of fertility that your soil can provide to your crop, the larger that period of time is where weeds are going to have a detrimental effect on its yield. And so you can see from the chart on the right, the table on the right, that this particular study was looking at nitrogen. And if you look at the time to control weeds, which severely affected the corn yields above 5%, when they didn't put any nitrogen into that system, you had to keep that crop free of weeds from the V1 stage to the V11 stage, fully canopied, if you weren't going to see a severe detriment to the yield of that crop. Now, as the fertility level increased, or as, quote unquote, the yield goal was increased and the fertility was added to meet it, the critical time to control those weeds narrowed quite a bit. It gave the farmer more latitude to get in there and control his weeds. So does that mean that a farm cannot operate at a lower yield if he doesn't have the cash flow to balance and buy the fertilizer for a higher yield? No, just be aware that you're going to need to keep the crop free of weeds for a longer period at a lower fertility level. And why I think this is very, very important is because the first slide here, we're looking at nutrient levels effects on crops growing with weeds. Well, the same is true if you want to think about it with crops growing with cover crops. When you have a corn plant in your field and you interseed that with a cover crop, if you're interseeding with a cover crop, the corn plant itself doesn't distinguish something we would call cover crop separately from what we call a weed. To the corn plant, all of those subsequent plants growing between the rows are weeds. So be aware, especially as we look at more integrated cover cropping systems, that if you're going to do that, you're running a higher risk of having that cover crop affect your yield if you're doing it under a lower fertility level. And that's true if it's nitrogen, it's true if it's potassium, it's true if it's any of the nutrients that are necessary for your plant's growth. So in some sense, when I sit down with a farm, particularly for the first time, and we have these discussions, a little bit comes to the planning phase of where are we today? Can I afford, do I spend the money on potentially a cover crop? Or for right now, do I work on building the fertility levels of my soil up? So then I can earn the right to put the cover crop into my existing crop. And I think sometimes we try to solve our fertility problems with cover crops, with different soil health aspects. And if you're already have ran a good fertility management on your farm, you have very good levels of fertility, you've earned the right to do that and to use those cover crops in your system. If you're inheriting a farm that was run down, if you have let your fertility levels slip, you actually could not only not help your fertility situation with cover crops and different soil health aspects, but you could actually hurt your crop production trying to solve your problem with soil health means. So I really wanted to bring up that slide. I think again, goes back to that blurring the lines between soil fertility and soil health. And I think it's very, very important that we distinguish between the two, because as this would show, trying to address soil health aspects can actually have a severe effect on your yield. And ultimately, you need that yield in order to be there next year and farming on your piece of ground. And really that, again, just relates to the basic things when we look at cover crops. And it doesn't really matter if it's nutrients, water, or sunlight. If that cover crop is competing with my primary crop for those nutrients, or vice versa, I will either not have a successful crop, or vice versa, I'll not have a successful cover crop. And it essentially was a poor ROI in relationship to the cost of seed and applying it. So again, when we look at a fertility plan, again, not just looking at nutrients, what you want to look at is those other variables that go into that cropping system, whether it be sunlight or water, and the availability of them. And looking at your fertility plan is a key component to looking at, is it strategic of this year in my system to put in a cover crop? Am I going to actually provide value? Or is it essentially running just a high risk that might compete with my primary crop? The other thing when it comes to the 4 R's is, and the right rate, is manure is not manure. I see a lot of farms, well, I just put on 2 tons of this manure, I put on 10,000 gallons of this manure, 3,000 gallons of this manure, and I just want to bring up the importance of testing your manure source on a regular basis. Here, for example, we're looking at a situation where there's 4 tons of manure applied from 2 different manure sources, and the one up top here is 60.4 pounds of nitrogen, for example. The one manure test 2 is 54.6. And putting on 4 tons of each of these manures, what we find is at the end of the year, that crop that had manure from testing source 2 would have 17 pounds of less nitrogen applied. And that will translate into yield, lower yield. So it's important not just looking at the soil test levels when coming up with a fertility plan, but it's also important to look at the analysis of the fertility source, whether it be manure or fertilizer that you're putting back on your piece of ground. Also, the type of manure, it enormously plays into the value that manure is going to have to the next crop. The situation where a farmer ran out of turkey manure and he went and he started filling in with this equal amount of tons of beef manure. And what you can see is from the test, the turkey manure was running around that 50 pounds of nitrogen per ton, while the beef manure was around 10. So 4 tons of the beef manure ended up being 129 pounds less nitrogen on a per acre basis. And essentially the corn in that part of the field was completely yellow. It did not have enough nitrogen to produce a crop. So manure is not manure. It's important to test, and it's important to understand what manure source you're using and putting it on at the right rate. The other thing when coming up with a fertilizer plan over your system is to look at your rotation, particularly with corn's place in the organic rotation as being king. The last number of years, there's been a significant number of producers that have essentially tried to come up with a rotation that focused on corn. And not to go into the specifics of every rotation, but what you can see is looking at a corn oats rotation versus a 3-year alfalfa oats or corn oats corn rotation. In the first one, I'm actually significantly building my phosphorus levels, which may at some point cause my farm to come under regulation from MPCA, elevating those soil test levels too high where they start limiting the total amount of manure I can apply on my farm. Vice versa, if I don't track my nutrient flow on a more extensive rotation, you actually could be depleting your soil over time and not putting enough nutrients to replace what you're removing off that farm. So it's important to look at your crop rotation from a year-to-year standpoint. It's also important to look at it in the context of the whole system. Right source, another key component of the 4 R's, and we do have a significant amount of materials available for us to put on organic farms and manage our fertility, whether it be a mine source such as potassium sulfate, gypsum, or different manures that are available to us, such as raw poultry litter, pellets, hog manure, dairy manure. Some farmers have access to various kinds of compost. From a nitrogen standpoint, some farms grow alfalfa in the rotation specifically for their nitrogen, or cover crop specifically for nitrogen, or to help cycle the nutrients in that rotation. One key part when we're looking at a right source, particularly when we talk about nitrogen, is the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that, whether it be manure or cover crop, because that's going to tell us how that breaks down over time. So something like poultry manure, which is a 10-to-1 nitrogen carbon to nitrogen ratio, is a much faster breaking down material than something that's very like beef manure, which may have a lot of corn stover or oat straw. And from the perspective, well, it won't run like pure oat straw from a carbon nitrogen ratio of 60-to-1. You'll often see values of over 30-to-1, which really slows down the release time of that nutrient source. So if I'm relying upon that nitrogen, what I want to make sure is that I'm putting it on or incorporating it so it's available to the crop when I need it. Again, the same thing is true for nitrogen credits from cover crops. Not only does it depend upon the total amount of material, the height of the cover crop that we incorporate, but it also depends upon the carbon to nitrogen ratio that is in that plant. And what you'll find is with cover crops, generally the more biomass you have, generally the higher carbon to nitrogen ratio you're going to have.
Hey, James, you're going through this. I just had a quick question. Maybe you already covered this before, but at what level of carbon to nitrogen ratio does that material actually tie up nutrients versus releasing it? Was it 30-to-1, or is it lower than that?
Normally about 20 to 25-to-1. And that partly you have to look at not just the material you're applying, but it makes a difference of how much other carbon you have in that system. So if I'm putting manure onto a field, let's say that has corn stover from the previous year, I have to take into account that I have a lot of carbon, maybe not from the manure, but in the system that's going to need to break down as well. So what you're really trying to do is, with the right time for manure, is when do I need to put it on? Where here with the red line, what we see is we have an early fall application that the nitrogen breaks down rapidly, let's say from poultry litter, and actually comes available over the winter. The problem is in the early spring, if we get a lot of rain, we have a lot of early spring rain with leaching, that nitrogen will actually leach out of the system before that plant ever has the opportunity to take it up. So with the black line here, what we really want to do is match up a manure release time. If the black line we want to think of as our nutrient demand from the crop, we want to match that with the blue line, which would be the release of the nutrients from the manure, let's say. And depending upon the carbon to nitrogen ratio and the type of manure we're using, we can manipulate the release time of that depending on if I apply it in the fall, early fall, spring, early spring, or even in season of the crop. Running a little bit short of time, so I'm going to speed this up.
Hey, James, we had another question come through the chat here. So how does composting manure affect nutrient levels?
So the quick and dirty answer to that is normally composting increases the carbon ratio to the nitrogen. And so it generally makes it a slower releasing material, which depending on what you're growing and what you're doing with it, you may or may not want. If I'm putting a material on in the spring, let's say for small grains, which is growing very, very rapidly in the spring and needs to see that nitrogen early in the season, compost may not be the correct material to use in that scenario. So you want to look at not only the carbon nitrogen ratio, but how that's going to integrate to the needs of the crop that you're going to put subsequently after that application. And looking here, the other thing to point out is generally the microbial activity is more upfront when you have a lower carbon to nitrogen material versus your microbial activity under a high carbon to nitrogen ratio is more sustained, or it's slower over time. The release of those materials then subsequently are basically inverse of those relationships. So something that's low in carbon nitrogen ratio, in the carbon to nitrogen ratio, generally releases very rapidly. Something that has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio generally releases very slow over time. And so if we want to think of the red material as being beef manure and maybe our blue line as being more representative of poultry litter, if I'm putting beef manure on in the spring, what you can see is you can have sometimes an 8, 9, 10-week tie-up where that corn isn't getting any nitrogen from that source. And any corn that goes 9, 10 weeks in the season without any nitrogen is going to be very yellow and essentially fail in that system. So again, very important with this black line to look at the needs of the nutrient of the crop and make sure that you match that nutrient release to the needs of that crop. I didn't have the slide, but one thing with the beef manure, one strategy is maybe in looking, rather than doing a spring application, shifting this curve and this release time by applying this beef manure earlier in the fall previous. And then it would rely upon then planning a rotation to enable you to do that. Obviously, if you have a full season soybean crop prior to your corn crop, it's not going to enable you to really put that material on in time where you can start that mineralization process of that material. So, and that again goes to looking at your fertility plan as a whole, pulling back and looking at it from a whole systems approach. How does this tie into my whole system? The third part of this, again, going with the best plan, is only useful if we have the execution, or if we want to think about it with the 4 R's, the right place. And with manure, typically when we talk about manure, what's very, very important is that we incorporate that manure into the soil. A lot of farmers don't understand the value that you'll lose by not incorporating that manure. But here, for an example, looking at those 4 tons of turkey manure, for example, having it incorporated right away provides the next crop with 169 pounds of nitrogen, versus if I'm just surface applying it, I'm only having 108 pounds left for that crop, and the rest, that 61-pound difference, is essentially flashing back up into the atmosphere. Or if you want to think of it either as a lost potential or you want to think of it as you have the same expense for fewer nutrients than looking at the nutrients that are going to actually be available to your next crop. The fourth part of your plan is to monitor in season. And why this is important is sometimes farmers put on more than sufficient nutrients for the crop that they're growing, and due to other reasons, whether it be weeds, whether it be some disease factor, an insect pressure, or weather aspect, they don't hit their crop yield. And sitting at the end of the season, just looking at a yield map is not going to tell you what had an effect on the crop over the cropping season. And it's very important as a farmer or either doing yourself or working with somebody to make sure you're going throughout the season and monitoring. So at the end of the season, you really know the variables that made up your yield equation. And then essentially at the end of the year, it's good to go back to step one, which is reassess from the data that you collected through your monitoring process over the season. Do a reassessment and see if your system A succeeded or if it failed. And then if it failed, why it failed. Was it something that you could have controlled, or was it a drought which was outside of your control? And using that is very important then for looking forward into the next year. So again, going back to that 4-step process to manage that fertility, it's important to do an assessment of where you're at, what you have available on your farm for resources, what you're growing in your system, come up with a good plan, execute the plan, and then monitor it to make sure your plan is having success. And with that, Matt, I think I left a little bit of time for questions. Hopefully I didn't put everyone to sleep. The hard thing with Zoom is you can't see your audience. So yeah, I didn't hear any snoring, but they're all on mute. So
empty blocks. Yeah, thank you very much, James. I really appreciate your taking the time and putting all the effort into speaking to all the folks today. I really appreciate that. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. Hopefully, again, if you recall, if you'd like to ask questions, type the chat functionality at the bottom of Zoom there. And you can either type your question in or ask to be unmuted if you'd like to ask your question in person. James, one thing that came up for me, I guess, in your presentation is, management considerations, and maybe this has a little bit more specificity than some of the things you had mentioned, and kind of like principles more so than specific practices. But can you comment a little bit about, fall plowing, nitrogen fixing crops like clover or alfalfa versus spring plowing, and how available those nutrient curves are? I'm sure that's probably been researched, but it'd be interesting to have your take on that.
Sure. Again, when you're plowing in, if you want to think of a legume crop or cover crop, however you want to term it or call it, again, that goes to the timing then of that release. So if I'm incorporating that in the fall, what I'm doing is, depending on if I'm doing an early termination, let's say end of August, right? I take my last harvest, my last crop of alfalfa, and I plow it in. What I'm doing is I'm speeding up the release time of that, where you can actually start seeing some nitrogen release potentially late in the season, especially if we have a warm fall like we did this season, before you actually have any crop planted. Vice versa, if you wait till right before the crop is planted, let's say the subsequent spring, to terminate your alfalfa, you're potentially going to see at least several weeks delay of breakdown of that material. And while in that first year, your alfalfa might get you 160 to 180 pounds of nitrogen release, you need to make sure that it matches up for the need of the crop. So if the crop is planted right after the alfalfa is terminated, and especially if we have a cool conditions right after then and the release time is delayed, I may have crop that, or may have a corn crop, for example, that needs 40, 50 pounds of nitrogen in those first month, 4 to 5 weeks, and there's nothing available to it. And so you'll see sometimes, especially in spring termination of alfalfa, you'll see corn planted into it, and it'll actually have a yellow phase. It'll sit there just stunted for about 2, 3, 4 weeks. And all of a sudden, you'll just be like a light switch. You'll see it actually green up. And by the time it hits head high, it'll be just a real dark, nice green. So the challenge of that is you've now stalled your crop out for 2, 3 weeks, enabling essentially weeds to compete with that crop. So managing that fertility or that nutrient release is critical to keep that crop from having a bad day. And especially in an organic system where you're relying upon the vigor of that crop to beat out the weeds, it can really shoot you in your foot as far as from weed control perspective.
Yeah, thanks. That really helps. I guess that gives a lot of credence to when people spring plow clover or alfalfa and kind of see that yellow flashing on their crop a lot of times if there's not enough window there, or if the timing is mismatched. obviously kind of reflects back to what you were saying about that. And another question.
Well,
oh, go ahead.
The other part I just finished up there, Matt, too, makes a big difference on whether or not you're harvesting that alfalfa prior to working it in. Because if you want to think of it again, the carbon nitrogen ratio of the material that you're working into the ground, if I'm just working in the root system, that generally has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio versus if I'm letting it grow, putting a foot of growth there, I might have 40 pounds of very readily available nitrogen in that lush green growth that I'm working in that can compensate then for that delayed mineralization of the root system. So there are ways to manage around it again, or putting a little subsequent nitrogen from a manure source maybe up front on a hayfield situation where you harvest it. There's ways to manage that carbon nitrogen ratio to maybe take care of it. So just wanted to bring it up as an example.
Gotcha. Thanks very much for that. We got several questions here. Hopefully we can get to most of them here. But question: do you track both ammonium and organic N in your manure analyses? And if you do, what do you do with those numbers?
It's good to know both of those. The ammonium value is going to tell you essentially how available the nitrogen is in that system. So if you don't have much ammonium, and I'm relying upon some early season upfront nitrogen, it's probably not going to be there. So the ammonium factor is more in relation to how available that's going to be as a source of N. The total nitrogen is important when looking at, and you can't look at total nitrogen again without looking at the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that material. That's going to tell you essentially what can be potentially provided over the release time of that material. So you're looking at really two different aspects, or those values point to two different aspects of how to manage that fertility source.
Yeah, gotcha. Had a question on biologicals. We might gloss over that a little bit because that's kind of its own can of worms. That's maybe a little bit too tricky to get into in a question and answer session. But maybe you could comment a little bit about what your own personal crop rotation is, and that you utilize. And it doesn't have to necessarily correspond to a nutrient management situation. I guess it's just a couple of people want to know.
Sure. So on our farm, we start with alfalfa in the rotation, and generally do several years of that. And then typically I'll do corn, beans, corn, to maybe, and then we'll do typically 2 years of small grain, followed with maybe another corn, soybean year, and then back to alfalfa. That varies a little bit on our farm. We farm everything from heavy ground to irrigated sand to dryland sand. And depending on the weed challenges of those different fields as well, we will tailor our rotation to deal with those different aspects, not just fertility, but also weed management and just risk factor as far as water management, really, on our farm. So I would say fertility is one component that needs to go into your rotation for sure, but it's not the only one you need to look at when looking at setting up a rotation.
What are your thoughts on, this is a question that came through, what are your thoughts on soybean end credits and availability of the subsequent crop? Is that really contributing a whole lot or not?
I think where, especially in the organic world, the question of soybean credits comes in is, and Matt, you've had enough experience walking soybean fields. When an organic farm says, I have a soybean field, when I'm sitting down, or had a soybean field and I'm sitting down in the winter, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered in regards to that. First question I would have was it competing very heavily with foxtail, where essentially you couldn't even see the beans. Well, if that's the case, and you let that foxtail get rank and mature by the time you get harvest, you just put a whole lot of carbon back into that system, and you're not going to have the same nitrogen credit that you would from a clean bean field. So I think that the trick with soybean credits, they're real. They certainly show up to the next crop, but it depends upon if you're talking about, or the other variables that come into that previous soybean year. Was it weedy? When were the soybeans planted? What were the height of the soybeans? Somebody that's planting early season, growing 50, 60 bushel soybeans is going to have more of an end credit than somebody that's maybe planting end of June and pulling 30 bushels of soybeans off. And that's the real challenge in an organic system, is it's not a cookbook method. There's so many variables that come into play, coming up with plan to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's all the factors going into it are so variable, as you pointed out. This kind of echoes back to our first question about timing of working down, different plow downs or using manure, other application like that. But assuming soil temperature and weather patterns, the time of that you work stuff down has a big impact on availability. Or maybe you could comment on that a little bit.
Sure. There was a real good study out of University of Wisconsin. I want to say it was 5-6 years ago, looking at tillage radish and its nitrogen release to the subsequent crop. So in this particular case, the crop or the radish was terminated at the same time in the fall, in the sense that it was froze off. But looking at the next spring, one spring had a very short or very quick warm up, and the farmer was right into the field right after winter, and that nitrogen was released pretty much completely to the subsequent corn crop. And then the following spring in the study, they had a very long warm period in the spring, and what they found was actually the nitrogen from that radish released prior to the corn ever being planted. And with the early spring rains, then it leached out before the corn had an opportunity to take it up. So, again, it goes to the type of material or even type of cover crop that you plant in your rotation. So if I'm going to put something like radish in the system, just be aware it has very rapid release, and you're going to have a very short window then for you to plant a crop behind that to take advantage or take up the nutrients that are released from that crop.
Great, thanks for that. There was a question here about a standard for timing of breakdown of all these various end sources, but it doesn't seem like, based on what you've said, that there is a standard. There's so many variables that it's hard to say. There's certainly release curves that have been well researched, but I think the message that I've come away with from your talk is that there's so many variables there, and monitoring and managing is an important component of that.
Correct, and it really has to do with your environment and your location. Your release time on poultry litter may be very different for somebody, let's say in northern Minnesota, than somebody that's in southern Iowa. So it's very hard as in the scientific community to come up with an exact curve that's specific to your farm, and that's the whole part of monitoring on your farm. Essentially, what you're doing is you're being a scientist on your farm. You're collecting all those data points to see, did I have early enough season release, or was it delayed? Was there a yellowing period for 2-3 weeks in the early spring? So there's a standard in the sense that there are general rules of thumb as far as how it releases, but there are a lot of variables that come into play on how that curve changes as far as when it actually releases, that are outside your control on a year-to-year basis. And you have to adapt to more of the average variables that you deal with in your location.
So for all the farmers on the call today, you can add citizen scientist to your multiple titles, including farmer and family person, etc. I like that. Just in the interest of time, I think we'll probably field one more here, and then we'll proceed with our break. But James, any thoughts on just kind of quick strategies to minimize runoff nutrients in an organic rotation? Again, not looking for any simple answer here, but maybe some, a couple key points to consider.
I think one of the important things is to build a rotation that matches up with the needs of your farm. For example, take someone that has a 6-month pit of dairy manure. He may consider, in order to take advantage of his nutrients better, rather than having to pump early in the middle of the summer and putting it on top of the ground over, let's say, alfalfa, maybe he plans more of an annual forage cropping system where he's doing 2 or 3 different annual forage crops, and he has the opportunity to apply that manure in between those crops and take full advantage of it with the next crop. So you can adjust the nutrients that you have available and protect them and keep them on your farm or recapture them on your farm if you build a rotation around them, versus just throwing them out there when you have to. But especially when it comes to erosion, where I see guys get caught there, is, you know, all the manure is planned to go late into the fall, going after full season corn, full season soybeans. There, depending on the fall and in the winter, especially as you move into the more northern climates, you may be caught where you can't incorporate that manure, and that's where you're really running a risk of having that manure either run off or volatilize and not be able to capture the nutrient value on your own farm.
Great. Well, really appreciate, again, James, you taking the time to be a part of our program today. I found it very informative, and I'm certain that a lot of the folks on the call here did as well. We got a lot of great questions. So at this time, we're going to take a pause.